Hello. Wow, that was great. Thank you all for staying. I'm very, very pleased to have the director of Blue Road, Edna O'Brien Story, here with us. Sinead O'Shea. We're very happy to have shown your film. So, as one of the greatest writers of the English language, it's kind of extraordinary to have a film made about Edna and to have her on camera. So bravo for that. Can you tell us how that came about?
Well, it's, I guess, a convoluted story in some ways. I studied English literature in university in Dublin, probably considered to be quite a good university course, but there was no question of Edna ever being on our syllabus. I remember the perception of her always was that she was very lightweight, quite frothy. I would never have queried that. And then I was asked by Publishers Weekly, which is a US magazine, to profile her about 10 years ago. And I was like, oh, okay, that's not very exciting. And so then I began to read her books. And not only did I understand they were brilliant, but I also connected to them very completely. Like they may as well have been describing my adolescence in the 1990s. They're so timeless and they so evoke Ireland and all its threats for young women, which, didn't change that dramatically over most of the 20th century. So I was very impressed by the books and I was curious to meet her. But then meeting Edna, as you can, I'm sure, see from the documentary, that is an experience. She is one of the most charismatic people I think that's ever lived. And so I was enraptured by her. Within minutes, I'm telling her all my secrets. We're weeping. We're then running around her kitchen looking for imaginary mice. And I never got over this encounter. I thought she was truly amazing. 2 years ago, I was heavily pregnant at a wedding, and I got talking to a stranger, and I quoted Edna O'Brien to her, and the stranger said, "Oh, she's one of my best friends." And I said, "Wow, that's surprising," because there was a very big age gap. Um, but that friend turned out to be a film producer called Barbara Broccoli, who makes the James Bond films. And she said, "You should make that for your next documentary." And I said, I should, because really all I'd have to do is just show up with a camera because she's so charismatic. She's, so extravagantly beguiling. Um, Unfortunately, Edna was not very interested in this idea, or at least that's what she communicated through her agent. So I spent about a year being rebuffed by her agent. And then eventually I contacted Barbara and I said, "Could you ask her yourself?" And so she did. And then I met Edna. So that interview that's kind of got the black background in it, that's my very first filmed encounter with Edna. And that took place in August 2023. And it was a great interview, but very short because she began to feel ill. But at the end of it, I said, "Just before you go, I just want to show you one thing." And I showed her, that piece on the laptop where a television crew have gone around to her family home. It's in the mid 1970s. And the dad sings Danny Boy, and the mum's kind of completely lying, saying, "I was never bothered by her books." And Evan's just sitting there, like so tense, presiding over this absolute pantomime. And I showed it to her and she was very struck by it. And she wrote to me the next day and she said, "Well, please make sure you include this in the film." And I was like, "Of course, absolutely," because I feel like this is the Rosetta Stone. So I felt like that's kind of where the relationship really began. And so then she asked me to read her diaries. Her diaries are kept in three different archives around the world. She said the most naked ones were kept in Emory College in Georgia. And so I had to go there and I had to read those. So that was, I guess, the genesis of the project.
How old was she when you started filming her?
She was 92 and a half. So she was just about to turn 93.
And how much interviewing did you do with her? I find that an hour, even to a young person, is a lot. They start to lose steam. How was your interview process?
Well, yeah, I mean, she just couldn't go on more than 30 minutes, really. So that first interview had to be cut short because she felt so ill. She went into hospital the next day. So then she began to send me voice notes because we'd had this, moment, I guess, of recognition that I was taking this very seriously through that laptop archive. So she began sending me these long voice notes via Barbara, who was visiting her every day in hospital. And so she'd sort of suggest ideas, things to avoid, various concepts, I suppose, that she had for the film. And then when she came out of hospital, I came back to her house and I did a few audio interviews as well. So I met with her quite a few times over the next 6 months. And then at the end of April 2024, so that's 6 months ago this year, she did a final interview for me on camera. And that's the interview that's in white in the film. And that's, it's less than 3 months before she dies. So it's such an extraordinary piece of archive, and I suppose as just an extraordinary experience to have
Yeah.
shared with her.
Yeah. Films on writers are just about the most difficult thing
Mm.
to crack because it's written. There's no visuals
Mm.
there. Um, did that give you pause? I mean, you've solved the issues brilliantly, but how did you come to that?
Well, you see, I knew it was Edna, and I just knew from that experience 10 years ago of interviewing her for Publishers Weekly just how charismatic she was and just how she would draw you in. So, I mean, I was so cavalier about it. I was like, we don't need archive. We don't even need to hear about her books. We just need her and a camera. Obviously, as we went on, I realized, no, we should use the archive because it's so remarkable. But, she is an exceptional writer because she is such an extraordinary presence also. So, it is very rich to engage with her archive and to have her interviews. And then in terms of her actual writing, I had different opinions about that, and they did evolve. I'm a little mistrustful, I suppose, of, excerpts being read out or things that start to feel too much like some kind of, academic study group, which of course are wonderful in themselves, but they're not very cinematic.
Right.
So I was interviewing Gabriel Byrne, and again, it was just on the spur of the moment. I just thought, oh, would you just read the first page of Country Girls to me? And, obviously he's such an exquisite reader and his voice is so exceptional. And then I thought, okay, well, that's one way into her writing. Um, and then, that there's the delightful process of going through her books and picking out passages that you think audiences will connect with and that also relate to the themes that you're trying to explore within the film.
Yeah. And oh, the diaries. I mean, that must have been incredible the first time you picked up one of her diaries and started leafing through. Do you remember what one of the first things that just
I
like
do.
knocked you out was?
I do, because it was a very protracted process. I was quite naive about it. So initially you'll be horror struck, but because we were so time deprived, I knew she had stomach cancer. They'd stopped treating it. She was in and out of hospital. So I knew I'd very little time, and I had this idea, which was possibly a bit grandiose, that she'd see the film and she'd rally, and so the film might keep her alive. I mean, it's really delusional. So I thought I need to accelerate this diary process. So I thought I began to liaise with a librarian in Emory, and so she set up a Zoom session, and she said she would read out the diary and I would write out what was in the diary. And so she just picked this random diary. It was from 1969. At that stage, Edna has just started to see R.D. Lang, but she's very in love with him. And she's also, I think, having an affair with someone else, but it's quite salacious. And this poor librarian
All that over Zoom.
but the librarian, she was such a modest person, and I mean, she was lovely. And but I remember her, she just at every page goes, oh, here comes another one. And she would just have to read out this filth, I have to say. Like, it was just because it's so ironic because her husband kept accusing her of having affairs early on in the marriage, and actually Edna was quite pure-hearted earlier on, but then she does become quite liberated, from the late 60s onwards. So anyway, I realized that process wasn't going to work, and the librarian just said, I don't have the time for this. But I think she may not have had the will for it either. So we had to go over to Georgia and photograph every single page because we weren't allowed to take them away with us. So that was, as I said, extraordinarily protracted. So it was, I'll probably never have an experience like this. We were trying to finance the film and write the film and make the film, and also simultaneously transcribe the diaries and also fit them into the film. So that was all happening at the same time. It was very intense. I've never been so obsessed with the project before.
I always wonder how writers, how artists come to their work, and the you just do it once in the diary where she writes novel. It's an idea, just 3 lines or 4 lines that would be great for the novel. And I thought, yeah, where was she walking down the street or in a cafe or something? And she had this thought and she wrote it down. And that's so revealing and so exciting. Um, and there was her husband writing in her diary.
I mean, he's such a cartoon
And
villain at
in
times.
red pen, no less.
Yeah.
And I would think that he would take them and burn them, but he didn't.
Mm. He did something which was far more damning to himself, which is
Yeah,
interesting that he felt he was above reproach to that extent. He had no fear of criticism. I think what happened incidentally with the diaries is I don't think he was, going back at night and rewriting over them. I think when she eventually left, she left in such a hurry that she left her diaries behind, and then he found them and he began to annotate them then. But it's just amazing, his he was so obsessed with her, and his revenge really went on for decades afterwards. So, and it's borne out by the same emotions and approach that we see in the diary. There's this obsession with her being shallow, with her being nothing, with him being the brains behind the operation, and it's real gaslighting. And it continued, long after she left him, for decades, into the 1980s, into the 1990s. He's telling all his peers in Ireland, she's a fraud, she's a sham, she didn't really write the books. One of my own classmates in university, when I told him I was going to write this book, he said, well, I always heard she hadn't written her books. It was just a completely commonplace idea about her. It's so amazing how insidious and how much more plausible it is that a man could have written these books about a place which is
right.
so intimate and so obviously Edna's own background and based on Edna's own experiences, and yet because they're good, it must have been written by a man. It's so amazing. But anyway, I'm very delighted for those annotations because I think they absolutely confirm what Ernest was like as a person.
Absolutely. Absolutely makes it so much more rich and gives you another
Mm.
element that clearly you probably had no idea was going to
No.
happen. And talk about the different styles that you put into the film, like shrinking the size of the frame and putting the sprockets in. Where did that idea come from, and how do you think it
Yeah.
worked?
Well, we had some really beautiful Super 8 footage. So I wanted to evoke that time, and I wanted to differentiate the different eras. Some was Super 8, some was very lovely, film work, Super 16 work by BBC. Then there was another type of film in the documentary, which to me is the centerpiece, the whole film, which is Carlo's own film, which he shot himself on Super 16 as a teenager. And so I came across this during our search for archive, and it was being presented on British television as, the world premiere of Edna O'Brien's teenage son's film of one of Edna's books. And when you hear these things, you're like, oh God.
I'm
But then,
screwed.
I know. But then when you watch the film, it's fascinating because what he's decided to do is he's adapted Night, which is quite an autobiographical book of Edna's. So in a way, he is documenting Edna's own family life. And so that's the footage that we get to see in the film. We get to
That's what
see,
you see her walking in the woods and
yeah.
by the
And you
lake. I
see her
wonder.
interacting with her father, him touching her on that cheek in that way that is just very troubling and yet potentially cathartic. And they're drinking tea together. And so Carlo is filming all this. And I mean, I feel Carlo, there was something driving Carlo's consciousness to document it in the way that he did. Edna's clasping the tree, just as she would have done as a child. I find that very powerful and thrilling as a piece of film.
Yeah. So let's switch and talk about you. This is your third film, right?
Okay. I'm sure you're already
Um,
going, oh God.
and it just looking at the descriptions of the films, it seems like they all have a thread of resistance against the
Hmm.
powers that be, in a sense, maybe, I don't know. Am I onto something?
Yeah, actually, I think that's a very astute observation. That yeah, it's strange that you said that. I was just thinking the other day, you know, how I had to apply for some funding for something, and I was just trying to describe it through films, and the word resistance kept coming up in them. Um, I suppose, especially my second film, it's about my hometown, and it's about some two doctors who opposed the church, and so they saved women from mother and baby homes and
Pray for Our Sinners,
pray
which
for
came out in
sinners. Yeah, and they fought
2022.
quite an amazing campaign against corporal punishment. And it was no revolution. It was very slow. It has taken decades for real change to happen in Ireland. Um, but I do like the idea that a resistance is possible, that we can, that, there is always a way to resist, is the final line of that film. I do like that idea. And I see in Edna, she did resist. My first film, A Mother Brings Her Son to Be Shot, which is about what the title says. It's about a mother bringing her teenage son to be shot. But it's actually about a whole community who just refuse to be a part of the United Kingdom. They're in Derry.
And
And
he's
so they,
shot to be punished, not to be killed.
yeah, to be punished because he's been accused of drug dealing, and this community self-polices. They don't believe in the police, they don't believe in the British government. So if someone steps out of line, the um, dissidents, distant Republicans, their militia organizes a punishment. But obviously, it becomes incredibly problematic and nuanced, and it doesn't really prove the most effective way of maintaining law and order. But it is, I suppose, there's probably a connection between all three. That I suppose there's a trauma element also. I see in Edna, I also saw in that first community, there's that kind of intergenerational trauma. And also, the way trauma forces, sometimes without realizing it, we recreate our mistakes. We keep going back to the flame because we haven't found a way to realize what it is. I see that in a lot of communities, probably across the world, that um, once you're stuck in a certain train track, I suppose it's very hard to jump out of that track once you're used to a certain type of behavior. An ex-IRA man I remember told me for my first film, he goes, once you've reached a certain level of adrenaline, it's very hard to come down.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that I find that to be a great truth in life. It's extremely difficult to undo certain types of behavior. And so you see with Edna, she grew up in such poverty and precarity, and she had this drive almost to return to it.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
so much money. And she met so many people who adored her, and yet she had this drive towards these men who treated her very cruelly, and then this
Yeah.
drive towards extravagance and also this drive towards these amazing gifts of self-expression and this brilliant work.
Well, thank you, Sinead, for showing it to us. Do you have distribution yet? Are we gonna be able to
I
see it?
don't know. I mean, I guess it's the great hope. There is no distribution yet. There is talk. I think.
It'll happen. It'll
Oh,
happen.
I don't
Tomorrow
know.
night, go, go, go.
You're so good.
Thank you, Sinead
Anyway,
O'Shea, for coming in and
thank you so
showing
much.
us Blue Road. the Edna O'Brien story.
Thanks
Take
so
great care.
much,
Have fun
Roger.
in New York. I'll see
Okay,
you on the
wonderful
street.
questions. Take care. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.